Good morning, church. What comes to mind when you think of the desert or the wilderness? I think of extreme temperatures, unforgiving terrain, and a lack of clean water. I think of it as a place where there's no permanent shelter, a place with dangerous animals. In short, it seems to be a harsh place, a place not kind to humans, and a place where we typically don't want to be. The desert or the wilderness is a common theme in the Bible. Here's a few examples. We see Moses, after killing an Egyptian, flee to the land of Midian, which was a desert area, and he was there for years before God called him to go back to Egypt. We see the nation of Israel sentenced to wander in the wilderness for 40 years before being allowed to enter the promised land. There are many more examples, such as Elijah going into the wilderness after Jezebel threatens to have him killed, and we can think about Job's suffering as a kind of wilderness. And most importantly, we know that Jesus went into the wilderness at the beginning of his ministry. Now, while the circumstances may be different in each of these examples, we see that God uses the wilderness to accomplish something. There may be an element of punishment in some of these stories, but not all. But I think that there's something deeper going on here than just a punishment. There's something more than just maybe the surface understanding that we glean the first time we read these stories. Moses is being humbled and prepared in Midian in order that he can go back to Egypt to lead Israel out of slavery. The same is true of Israel as they wander. They must be purified before they can enter the promised land. Job was an innocent man, but he was forced to suffer, and in a sense, he learned from this suffering. Jesus was brought into the wilderness. He was tempted. At the end of his ministry, he would be in the Garden of Gethsemane, sweating blood. He would then be tortured and crucified, but for a reason. The good news is that God used the wilderness to bring something of great value. Moses was called by God to lead the Exodus. Israel was brought into the promised land. Job heard from God himself. And Jesus saved the world and is now sitting at the right hand of the Father. Back in 2020, the night before my wife and I and our business partner had to shut down our restaurant, I had a friend that came back into the kitchen where I was cleaning. He was a guy who had been through a business failure himself, so he kind of knew the position we were in. He gave me a big hug and he told me how much he enjoyed our restaurant. And then he told me this: God doesn't waste any suffering. When you're in the desert, or if you're in the wilderness, it can seem almost hopeless at times. But we have to remember that God is present and that he doesn't waste that time. In fact, God leads us into the wilderness because he has great things to prepare for us. Now, whether our own failures lead us into the wilderness or we're brought there through no fault of our own, we know that God is not going to waste that time. Let me read a passage for you out of Hosea chapter 2, it's verses 14 and 15. Therefore, I am now going to allure her. I will lead her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. There I will give back her vineyards, and I will make the valley of Achor a door of hope. There she will respond as in the days of her youth, as in the day she came up out of Egypt. The context is that Israel has rebelled, and this rebellion has consequences, but God is planning to restore them. God calls them into the wilderness. It's a barren place, but it's a place where God's tender voice can be heard. Not that God doesn't speak in other places, but as C.S. Lewis says, pain insists upon being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, he speaks to us in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. I hope that you are personally experiencing a time of great blessing, financial, physical, emotional, relational, but chances is even if you're in a good time right now, there's going to be a difficult time on the way. I want you to think about those difficult times, those times in the wilderness, those times in the desert, as a blessing. It is a time of preparation for us to hear God, and there's nothing greater than to hear the voice of the Creator. Let me read to you a quote from A.W. Tozer. It comes from his little book called The Root of Righteousness. And he says this: It is doubtful whether God can bless a man greatly until he has hurt him deeply. God actually rises up storms of conflict in relationships at times in order to accomplish that deeper work in our character. We cannot love our enemies in our own strength. This is graduate level grace. Are you willing to enter this school? Are you willing to take the test? If you pass, you can expect to be elevated to a new level in the kingdom. For he brings us through these tests as preparation for greater use in the kingdom. I want you to think about this because there are times of life that are easy and there are times of life that are difficult. And I will say that God is using each and every one of those moments. He doesn't waste any of it. He redeems that which we squander. I'll be praying for you. Please pray for me. And Lord willing, I'll see you next week.